The Jelly Doughnut. In 2014, the Opportunity rover was busy exploring a small patch of Martian ground when it sent back a photo that left NASA scientists genuinely baffled. In a spot that had been completely empty just 12 days earlier, a mysterious rock had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The size of a golf ball, it was white on the outside and had a deep reddish-pink center. The internet immediately dubbed it the Jelly Doughnut. And for a few weeks, people were convinced we had finally found evidence of Martian biology, or perhaps a very confused alien baker. The rock didn't look like any of the other stones in the area. It wasn't dusty or weathered. It looked fresh, like it had been dropped from the sky. Some theorists suggested it was a piece of a nearby meteorite, while others thought it might be a weird fungal growth, or a Martian mushroom that had sprouted overnight. The truth, however, was a bit more accidental. After a closer look, NASA realized that the doughnut wasn't an alien life form. It was a victim of a hit and run. As the rover was turning in place, one of its wheels had accidentally caught a larger rock, flipped it over, and dragged it into the frame. The jelly center was actually a rare, manganese-rich mineral that had been protected from the Martian atmosphere for billions of years, hidden on the underside of the rock. The face on Mars. If there is one image that launched 1,000 conspiracy theories, it's this one. In 1976, NASA's Viking 1 spacecraft was orbiting Mars, snapping photos of a region called Cydonia, when it captured something that stopped scientists in their tracks. Rising out of the Martian desert was a massive 2-mile-long rock formation that looked exactly like a human face staring directly up into space. It had a forehead, 2 distinct eye sockets, a nose, and a symmetrical mouth. The face on Mars immediately became a global sensation. It wasn't just a weird rock. To many, it was the smoking gun, the ultimate proof that an ancient, advanced civilization had lived on Mars and built a monument to themselves, much like the Great Sphinx in Egypt. For over 20 years, the mystery grew, fueled by low-resolution photos and the imagination of millions who believed NASA was hiding the truth about our neighbors. But in 2001, the Mars Global Surveyor returned to Cydonia with much better cameras. When the high-definition photos came back, the monument vanished. The face was actually just a natural, flat-topped mountain, a mesa that had been eroded by billions of years of wind. The features we saw in 1976 were a trick of light and shadow, combined with a psychological phenomenon called pareidolia, where the human brain is hardwired to find familiar patterns like faces in random shapes. The Mars Blueberries. In 2004, the Opportunity rover was rolling across a flat gray plain called Meridiani Planum, when it found something that looked like it belonged on a breakfast plate rather than a desolate planet. Scattered across the ground, and even embedded inside the Martian rocks, were millions of tiny, perfectly round, blue-gray spheres. They were about the size of a BB pellet, and because they were so distinct from the jagged red landscape, NASA scientists immediately nicknamed them Martian Blueberries. At first glance, they looked like they could be biological, perhaps some kind of ancient fossilized eggs or a strange Martian seed. But when the rover's spectrometers analyzed them, they found they were made of a mineral called hematite. On Earth, hematite spheres like this almost always form in one specific way, inside layers of sedimentary rock that are soaked in liquid water. As water flows through the ground, minerals slowly crystallize around a central point, growing layer by layer like a pearl inside an oyster. These are known as concretions. The blueberries weren't just a weird geological quirk. They were the first definitive proof that Mars wasn't always a dry, dusty desert. Billions of years ago, this exact spot was likely a soaking wet environment, with water flowing through the soil for ages. The Martian Doorway. In May 2022, the Curiosity rover was climbing the side of Mount Sharp when it captured an image that looked like the ultimate gotcha for ancient alien theorists. Cut perfectly into the side of a rock face was what appeared to be a dark, rectangular opening. It looked like a carved entrance to an underground bunker, a Martian doorway that seemed way too geometric and deliberate to be a random act of nature. The internet exploded with theories about hidden Martian cities and secret bases built into the cliffs. If you were standing right in front of it, however, the illusion of a secret base would quickly fall apart. For starters, the doorway is actually tiny, only about 12 inches wide and 17 inches tall. Unless the Martians were the size of a house cat, it wouldn't be much of an entrance. When NASA scientists looked at the high-resolution data, they realized the door was actually a natural fracture in the rock called a shear tension crack. Mars is a world of extreme temperature swings and seismic activity, what we call Marsquakes. These forces put immense pressure on the layered sandstone of Mount Sharp, causing it to snap in straight, clean lines. A piece of the rock simply fell away, leaving behind a rectangular gap that happened to be perfectly backlit by the sun. It's a classic case of perspective. From the rover's specific angle, it looked like a threshold to another world. But from any other side, it's just a broken rock in a very old mountain. The floating spoon. In 2015, the Curiosity rover was scanning the base of Mount Sharp when it sent back a photo that looked like it belonged in a zero-gravity kitchen. Suspended in midair, casting a long, distinct shadow on the ground below, was a long-handled spoon. It didn't just look like a rock shaped like a utensil, it appeared to be physically floating, completely disconnected from the Martian surface. It was a perfect, delicate structure that seemed to defy every law of gravity we know. The floating spoon is one of the most famous examples of a geological rarity called a ventifact. On Earth, we have thick air and liquid water to shape our landscape, but on Mars the primary architect is the wind. For billions of years, thin Martian winds have been carrying fine grains of sand blasting the rocks at high speeds. Because the atmosphere is so thin, the wind can carve out incredibly fragile, gravity-defying shapes that would snap instantly under Earth's heavy air and strong gravity. The spoon isn't actually floating. It's attached to the main rock face by a very thin, narrow neck that is hidden by the angle of the camera. The black spiders. If you were looking at satellite images of the Martian South Pole during the spring, you might think the planet was being overrun by a massive, terrifying infestation. Thousands of dark, spindly shapes, looking exactly like giant, hairy spiders, appear to crawl across the frozen dunes. Some of these creatures stretch for over half a mile, with long, crooked legs branching out from a dark central body. They aren't just in one spot. They appear in clusters, covering the landscape in what looks like a scene from a sci-fi horror movie. Despite their appearance, these aren't living things. They are a phenomenon known as araniforms, and they are unique to the red planet. Mars has a seasonal cycle just like Earth, but because it is so cold, its polar caps aren't just made of water ice. They are covered in a thick layer of frozen carbon dioxide, or dry ice. When the spring sun begins to hit these ice sheets, it doesn't melt the bottom layer into liquid. Instead, the heat passes through the translucent ice and warms the dark soil underneath. The soil gets so hot that the bottom layer of ice turns instantly into gas, a process called sublimation. Pressure builds up until the gas erupts through cracks in the ice like a geyser, carrying dark volcanic dust with it. As the dust settles back down onto the white surface, it falls into these wind-blown radial patterns that look like spindly legs. The spiders are actually scars on the surface of Mars, created by the planet literally breathing out gas every time the seasons change. The thigh bone. In 2014, the Curiosity rover was navigating a debris-filled area of Gale Crater when it captured a photo that looked like a scene from an interstellar archaeological dig. Resting among the jagged rocks was a smooth, light-colored object that looked exactly like a fossilized human femur. It had the distinct rounded knobs on the ends and a long, tapered shaft. This wasn't just a weird rock. It was anatomically suggestive. The internet immediately went into a frenzy, claiming it was the skeletal remains of a large Martian organism. If Mars had water and an atmosphere, why wouldn't it have had complex life with skeletons? The reality is a bit more grounded. NASA's science team identified it as a piece of sedimentary rock shaped by aeolian erosion. On Mars, different layers of rock have different hardness levels. As billion-year-old winds sandblast the surface, the softer material vanishes, leaving behind the more resistant core in strange rounded shapes. Because our brains are hardwired for pareidolia, the tendency to see familiar patterns like faces or bones. We see a thigh bone where there is actually just a very lucky piece of sandstone. It's a perfect example of how Mars can sculpt its own mysteries if you give the wind enough time. The golden sulfur crystals. In May 2024, the Curiosity rover accidentally performed one of the most important scientific blunders in the history of Mars exploration. While driving across a region called Geddes Vallis, the 4-ton rover crushed a nondescript yellowish rock under its wheels. When the cameras looked back at the damage, they didn't see the usual red dust. They saw a cluster of brilliant, translucent, canary yellow crystals. This wasn't just a pretty rock. Upon analysis, NASA confirmed these were pure elemental sulfur. To put that in perspective, Scientists have found sulfur compounds like sulfates all over Mars for years, but finding the pure raw element is a total anomaly. On Earth, elemental sulfur only forms in very specific, intense environments, usually around high-heat volcanic vents or hot springs. There was absolutely no geological model that predicted a field of pure sulfur sitting on the surface of this specific crater. It's the equivalent of finding an oasis in the middle of a desert where the math says water shouldn't exist. This discovery suggests that Mars' chemical history was far more violent and complex than we thought. These golden crystals aren't just treasures. They are a massive missing piece of the Martian puzzle that we only found because we happened to step on it. The Mars rat. In 2013, a panoramic photo from the Curiosity rover sent the internet into a meltdown. Huddled between two rocks was a shape that looked exactly like a Martian rat. It had a distinct snout, eyes, and a long dark tail trailing behind it. For weeks, Mars rat was trending everywhere, with people convinced that NASA had accidentally photographed a small, furry survivor living in the dust. If it was a rat, it was a very patient one. It didn't move an inch while the rover snapped multiple photos. When scientists zoomed in, the fur turned out to be just the rough texture of a volcanic rock. The tail was a thin, dark shadow cast by the rock's edge. This is another classic example of pareidolia. Because our ancestors needed to spot predators hiding in the grass to survive, our brains evolved to see animals in random shapes. On Mars, that survival instinct turns a simple piece of basalt into a cosmic rodent. It wasn't a biological discovery. It was just a geological Rorschach test.